Introduction to homeostasis. We're going to cover a very quick overview of what homeostasis is, look at some of the components that are involved in maintaining homeostasis, and talk about positive and negative feedback loops. So this word comes from the same, homeos and stasis, standing still. And so again, this is about maintaining the conditions necessary for life. So homeostasis is the maintenance of relatively stable internal environment for all living things, but we'll specifically be looking at mammalian vertebrates. And we know that even though the external environmental conditions are going to be constantly changing, the internal environment itself must be maintained. And this is what homeostasis is all about. So this involves mechanisms that essentially detect these changes. So these are types of sensors, biological sensors, and things that are going to cause a response to that. So these are effectors, and lots of different varieties as to how we can detect these changes and then respond to them. So the two systems that are involved in doing this, we have the nervous system and the endocrine system. So I'm sure you've heard of the nervous system. This is essentially your neurons, as well as your central nervous system, your brain, your spinal cord. The endocrine system, this is essentially the chemical system that is going to be in control of this, and this is going to be involving hormones. So to maintain homeostasis, we have the nervous system, and it's going to be detecting changes in the external environment, generally involved with rapid responses to those changes, and again is able to control and coordinate bodily activities. Then there's the endocrine system. So depending on the sound of your volume at that point, if you have a sudden stimulus that may frighten you, there's going to be a combination between the nervous system and the endocrine system responding to that. And so if you are startled by a loud noise, say, your nervous system is able to detect that change. Some of the responses, and you may have many involved with it, but some of them are going to be due to the endocrine system. So if you are frightened, your heart, you may feel beating faster. That can be a result of the hormones being released into your blood system that will cause your heart to beat faster. So it's not that the endocrine system is that slow. It's not quite as quick as, say, the nervous system, but it does tend to last a lot longer as well. So it's a little bit slower to get started, and it can be a little bit slower to come back down from that heightened state of awareness. So some conditions that are maintained, and this is a brief list of them, but say, for example, glucose in your blood, which is really important to maintain the metabolism that we need to have glucose to use as energy. Osmoregulation, so water levels as well as the levels of ions in our blood, all controlled and maintained at relatively consistent levels. The concentration of waste products as well, those can't build up too high, and so we'll talk a lot about the excretory system in this as well. Concentration of oxygen to make sure that you are breathing enough to get enough oxygen to your cells and get rid of the amount of carbon dioxide that your cells are producing. So the rate at which you're breathing is also really important for homeostasis. Your blood pH, and we have lots of chemical means of maintaining that, including buffers. Blood volume and blood pressure related to each other as well. And then something that I'm sure you've experienced where you get hot or cold, you can see all the responses that your body will do to try to, if you're cold, bring up your body temperature. If you're hot, bring down your body temperature. All of these involve coordinations between your nervous system and your endocrine system in order to maintain those internal conditions. So for example, with glucose, when you exercise, you're using a lot of energy. So whatever your glucose levels were previously, they will dip to some amount. Now we know we have other ways of getting energy, so fats and proteins and whatnot we can also break down, but it's the glucose that is in our blood that is readily available. So while we're using it intensively, it will drop. And then of course, after you eat something that has a lot of glucose in it, it will rise, and you will suffer negative consequences if it goes too far in either direction. So if it's too low, not good, too high, not good. It has to be maintained, and that's what homeostasis is all about. Temperature, same thing. So if you start exercising, your body temperature will go up, and so your body will have to adapt to try to bring that temperature back down. If your temperature is too cold, your body's going to have to change as well and maintain those internal body temperatures somewhere pretty close to 37, because otherwise everything else in your body is unable to function. Blood pressure, same idea. It does fluctuate, it does rise. So when you're doing exercise, it's higher. When you're sleeping, it's lower. So it does go up and down, but it's about maintaining a relatively constant mid-level. That's what homeostasis is. Not too high, not too low, just right. So the biofeedback is where we have information gathered by the body, and it is not conscious information. This is information that is being sent to our central nervous system that we're generally not aware of in most cases. So it's sent to the brain and it's monitored and maintained in order to keep these conditions constant. That's homeostasis. Negative feedback loops are the mechanism that our body uses to maintain homeostasis. So the body response leads to a decrease in the actual stimulus. So the response, once the stimulus is detected, the response leads to a decrease in the stimulus, which then, if the stimulus is less, it will feed back and not have as much of a response on it. So it's a negative feedback trying to counteract the stimulus by having a certain response. So if your body temperature rises, that's the stimulus is your temperature is too high. So the response would be something like sweating as well as a whole bunch of other things. And therefore the extra heat is going to be dissipated by your sweat. And therefore the extra heat that was the stimulus to begin with is now lower. So now there's less of a response to it. So it's a negative feedback loop. The opposite of that would be a positive feedback loop. And this is where the body's response intensifies the stimulus, which then increases the response. So you can see that this would not maintain homeostasis. This would cause something to come about, something to happen. This would be a positive feedback loop. So to maintain homeostasis, we need negative feedback loops, though there are also examples of positive feedback loops. So the stimulus response feedback loop, and this is going to be a negative feedback loop if it's trying to maintain these stable conditions. So the stimulus could be something like an increase in ion concentration in your blood. So that's going to trigger a particular sensor that is essentially going to say, okay, we've got too many ions in our blood. So there's going to be an integrator that is going to take that signal and do something with it. And it doesn't have to be a particularly complex thing. It's just sort of an intermediate between where the sense is being picked up, where that change is being picked up, and then where the signal is being sent to something that can do something about it. And so that integrator is generally our central nervous system, and there's normally some way of picking up on these signals being sent to us from the sensor. So we have little cells that can detect a concentration change in the ion concentration in our blood. And so if it's getting too high, this integrator will send a signal and say, okay, we've got to release some hormones that will collect more water. So we won't get rid of as much water as we would because we've got too many ions, so we need more water. And so this signal gets sent to the effector. And so what that will do is it'll increase the amount of water in our blood. So that's the response to it. And because we now have more water in our blood, the increase in ion concentration gets shut down. And so now there isn't as many ions in our blood, concentration-wise, and therefore you don't have the signal going to the sensor being picked up by the sensor, and you don't have that, and this whole system has been shut down. So this is a negative feedback loop. It's where the response goes back and shuts down the stimulus, and that will maintain homeostasis. So that is a negative feedback loop. If the response went back and actually increased the stimulus, then we'd have a positive feedback loop, and you would not have homeostasis maintained. So we have these receptors, which are essentially part of our nervous system. We're picking up a change to the environment. And again, that could be the internal environment, like the ion concentration in your blood, or it could be something external to us. So for example, the rods and cones in our eyes are able to pick up light. And so if they're not picking up as much light, what they'll do is they'll send a signal and they'll say, okay, we're not picking up as much light, and so then we can send that signal to the brain. Also things like sound and smell, obviously chemical detection, pressure detection as well, all of those are able to be picked up by different types of neurons in our body. The integrator is getting those signals, so the signals are sent to our central nervous system, often our brain, and then the brain is going to send out a signal to an effector that causes something to happen. And so a muscle's an easy effector to imagine. Your brain sends a signal to your muscle, and your muscle then does something like contracts. But say something like if there's an increase in darkness or less light, then those signals are sent to our brain, and our brain says, okay, it must be nighttime, so maybe we'll start producing some melatonin so we can shut down our body and go to sleep because we haven't seen light in a while. And so that central nervous system is not just sending signals to our muscles. It's not just muscles as effectors, but it also could be, say, the production of a particular hormone or the decrease in the production of a hormone. Lots of different ways of having those effects realized. So let's look at this stimulus and response cycle that we can have with regards to a negative feedback loop, and we'll relate it to temperature and thermostats. And so we have a particular variable that we're looking at. So in this case, we'll use temperature as our example. And if you want to maintain, say, the temperature of your house at, let's say, 20 degrees, that's the point that you're trying to maintain. That's the conditions you're trying to maintain. And so if there is an imbalance, there are sensors that will pick up on that. So your house itself has temperature sensors in it, and there is a thermostat that controls. So the sensors send the signal to your thermostat, and then your thermostat sends a signal to some sort of effector that will do it. Now, again, this can work in two different ways. And so, for example, if your house is too cold, so let's say it drops down to like 18 degrees Celsius, then that signal is picked up by the sensor, and the sensor sends that information to the control center, which could do something like say, okay, I'm going to turn on the furnace. And so the furnace comes on, and then the temperature will go up from 18 degrees, and maybe it'll even overshoot it or something like that and go to 21 degrees. And then that signal is picked up by the receptor again as to what the current conditions are, gets sent to the control center, in this case the thermostat, and then can be sent to the effector saying, okay, let's turn off the furnace and let the temperature go back down. So we end up with this homeostasis being maintained. And it's not that it stays perfectly constant. It will vary up and down between the a little bit low and a little bit high in terms of the perfect conditions, but it's able to maintain that balance whenever there is an imbalance. Our body works exactly the same way on many levels in terms of even temperature regulation. We have sensors that pick up too hot or too cold. If your body is too hot, you sweat. If your body is too cold, you get goosebumps. And those are built as a way of trying to cause a change to the stimulus to get your body temperature back to maintaining that balance. So for example, let's look again at a negative feedback loop. So there's a particular stimulus that is picked up by a receptor. That receptor is signaling sending that signal to the integration center, often our brain. And so that pathway, so you got to think our nervous system essentially has two pathways. The afferent pathway, which is sending things at the central nervous system, your brain, and then there's the efferent pathway. So signals are going to and from the brain constantly, and the brain is going to send signals along the efferent pathway to some sort of effector. So for example, if your body temperature is too cold, the receptors are picking that up, and they're sending that signal through the afferent to the central nervous system, the brain. And then your brain can say, okay, let's send some signals to our muscles and cause our muscles to start twitching, shivering, and that will hopefully cause an effect that will shut down the response shut down the stimulus. So the response itself is shivering in this case, and so that should increase the body temperature. So the stimulus, which was your body was too cold, is now going to get shut down by the response of shivering. And notice that this is happening subconsciously. It is not something that your conscious body is often aware of. It is something that your brain is taking care of without your consciousness needing to be aware. You don't have to think, oh, I'm cold, I better start shivering. Your body takes care of it for you. So the response will cause a decrease in the stimulus, and you get a negative feedback loop. Contrasting that to a positive feedback loop, you actually have a stimulus that is picked up by a receptor and sent to the central nervous system, and then the central nervous system will send the signal to an effector, which will actually go back and cause more of the stimulus itself. So something like childbirth, where you have the pressure on the uterus causing the uterus to contract, which would cause more pressure on the uterus, which would cause it to contract even more. And that would be a positive feedback system where the actual response to the stimulus causes more of the stimulus. That's a positive feedback. And that is not how we maintain homeostasis. It's how we have some sort of thing come about, like the birth of a child.